Hello, I'm Mike Druckman. I'm a partner in the international law firm Hogan Lovells. I co-chair our firm's global cell tissue and gene therapy team, which comprises over 150 lawyers and professionals around the globe in 5 continents, trying to bring the best of our skills to those developing regenerative medicines throughout the world. I'm really fortunate. Well, first, I'd like to thank Bernie Siegel, the Regenerative Medicine Foundation, the Wake Forest Institute of Regenerative Medicine, for this opportunity to present to this esteemed audience. I'm fortunate to have 2 esteemed colleagues of mine on our global team here for this segment of the Hogan Lovells World Compass. We have Charlotte Damiano from Paris and James Wong from Washington, D.C. They'll each give a brief introduction to themselves, but I will say they each have deep experience in market access issues, including pricing and reimbursement issues. So as you know, many of the innovative and life-saving therapies and cellular therapies in Europe, they're called advanced therapy medicinal products, or ATMPs. They're very expensive and they pose challenges to government reimbursement systems to ensure that patients who desperately need them can get them. So let's just jump in. Charlotte, we'll start with you. If you could say a few words about yourself and your practice, and if you could then please briefly describe the reimbursement process for ATMPs in France and the EU, and whether there are any specific criteria for ATMP reimbursements in your jurisdiction.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, correct. So I'm a partner in the health department of the Paris office of Hogan Lovells. As you just mentioned, we are part of a international law firm, and I work particularly on market access issues in France and Europe. The specificity is that I have a wide-ranging practice in this area, which is partly based first on negotiating with the authorities. So negotiating means negotiating health technology assessment, prices, and reimbursement with the Ministry of Health in France. And the second part of my practice is litigation on these market access issues where negotiations have failed. And I also participate with the ministry and clients on an individual basis, but also for professional organizations in negotiating, drafting, preparing the bills that will enter into force each year in France to regulate market access. Regarding your question, Mark, on the French system, basically is the same as in all EU countries. First, you have a stage of health technology assessment, meaning that the French authorities will assess your product, and for ATMPs, it's particularly critical. The French authority will assess the innovative level of the product and will grant a mark. And depending on this level of health technology assessment, we will then go to the ministry and ask for a price. And as you mentioned, it's generally said that ATMPs have the higher prices or requests for prices, at least by the pharmaceutical companies. And it's very challenging to discuss with the authorities of the prices of such ATMPs. And we can discuss further of the structuration of the contract, outcome-based agreement, etc. There are very sophisticated price agreements that we have to discuss with the authorities. And new law recently entered into force, but I will discuss further this topic.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Charlotte. James, we'll turn to you. If you could please start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your practice, and then tell us a little bit about how the U.S. reimbursement system works and what makes it unique and challenging for gene and cell therapies.
Sure, happy to do so. So I'm James Wong. I'm a counsel in the healthcare regulatory practice here at Hogan Lovells in the Washington, D.C. office. And my practice focuses on U.S. healthcare regulatory issues, in particular coverage and reimbursement issues, especially involving large governmental payers like the Medicare agency or state Medicaid agencies. And in that capacity, I've worked with a lot of developers of transformational medicines, including gene and cell therapy developers, as well as developers of regenerative medicines like ATMPs and other skin substitutes. As to what makes the US reimbursement system unique and challenging for gene and cell therapies and other developers, I mean, a lot of things, but perhaps foremost, it's that the US healthcare system, it's really a patchwork of different payment systems. So rather than there being a single governmental payer, as you might see in some countries, the US has countless different payers and payment systems. And for gene and cell therapies and other transformational medicines, it really poses challenges across all of those different payment systems because those types of technologies are so unique. And what we've seen over the past several years is many payers beginning to think about sort of what reimbursement might look like for novel gene and cell therapies. And programs like the Medicare agency, our nation's largest payer, have led the way in terms of creative thinking. For example, a few years ago, they developed a pathway for the CAR T cell therapies that led to the highest paying inpatient payment bundle in Medicare. But there are a whole lot of open questions with respect to next generation gene and cell therapies, in part because, especially for programs like Medicare, it's not just sort of a traditional negotiation, right? They're all sort of filtered through the prism of complex legal and statutory rules. And those rules tend to be decades old and definitely not developed with gene and cell therapies in mind. So there are a whole lot of quirks to the system, right? Things like the site of service, whether it's inpatient or outpatient, is it classified as a drug or biological? Those can all put you down a different reimbursement pathway, and they can matter a great deal with respect to sort of reimbursement adequacy for your gene and cell therapy. So in other words, all those details and technical sort of nitty-gritty legal sort of frameworks matter a lot in programs like Medicare, and that can be challenging as well as quite unique in thinking about US reimbursement strategy.
Great, thank you so much, James. Really appreciate the insights. Now we'll turn back to Charlotte. I want to give you a chance to drill down. You had alluded to some of the details, and I'd like to give you a chance to talk about that, including what some of the particular challenges are in more detail about reimbursing ATMPs in France and Europe, and how that's currently being addressed.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, ATMPs is a real challenge in market access because, as you know, of course, for pharmaceutical companies, they want to have high prices compared to their high development costs. So they come and see us and see the authorities with high expectations. Generally, it's a global EU strategy for pharmaceutical companies. They try to have the same strategy in all EU countries, but the specificity is that market access, pricing, reimbursement is really addressed locally. It's a local decision of each member state in Europe. So each member state can have a different opinion on the scientific assessments, on the price, and on the reimbursement. And for example, if the UK or Germany, Spain, Italy decide to reimburse a product, French authorities may decide not to reimburse, for example, for a problem of price. The French authorities, traditionally, they are known as the tougher authorities in Europe to price pharmaceutical products. And they are not changing their way of thinking for ATMPs. For many years, the French authorities said that they were willing to have outcome-based pricing agreement. You must have heard about that in Europe. Germany already implemented many of them, but in France, actually, there are very few outcome-based pricing agreements. For example, the CAR-Ts on the market that you know, for example, the Yescarta, developed by Gilead, Kymriah, etc. They have classical pricing agreement with the Ministry of Health, because the French Ministry of Health is not yet convinced by such performance agreement or outcome-based agreement, and they want to have control of the risk. It may change in the coming years because in 2023, a new law entered into force, and the French authorities are willing to put in place for new ATMPs and, for example, new CAR-Ts, they are willing to put in place real outcome-based pricing agreements and what we can call we want to see before paying. So they want to negotiate pricing agreements with real-world evidence, guarantees of the efficacy of the treatment. And so even though the European Medicine Agency called EMA is really giving a guideline when assessing the product for granting the marketing authorization, the EMA is assessing the efficacy, safety, etc. But even though the EMA is rendering a favorable decision for market access, for commercialization, sorry, the French authority may have a different view for reimbursement purposes, and they will have their own assessments. So we are really hoping that the outcome-based pricing agreement will develop in the future years, but it's really a start in France, whereas in other European countries, it has already been implemented.
Interesting, very important. And so are those reforms part of the pharmaceutical reform project, or is that something different?
No, it's different, Mike. It's really local reform, French reforms. The pharmaceutical package is not addressing specifically pricing and reimbursement, again, because this is a local decision. There is no harmonization in Europe on pricing and reimbursement. The only harmonization is the marketing authorization granted by the European Medicine Agency. And we are seeing maybe a first start of harmonization on health technology assessment, because a new regulation, new guidelines is coming from the European Commission for a normalized health technology assessment. We do not know yet how it will be harmonized, because again, each European country has its own rules. But the plan is that in 2025, we will have an harmonization of the scientific assessment of every product. But still, we don't know yet how. So the pharmaceutical package, Mike, to answer your question, is not addressing pricing and reimbursement, but it's giving guidelines and new rules on innovative therapies, for example, on patent exclusivity, which is an important issue because the duration will be decreased. So it's a significant impact for innovative treatments. It would be, at least. It's also simplifying procedures, reducing costs. So it will indirectly have impact on pricing and reimbursement, but the decision will remain local.
And no doubt Hogan Lovells will be following all these developments and being in a position to
yes, we are following
stay on top. And speaking of staying on top of changes, we'll switch back to the US, James. And I'd like to ask you about, I understand there have been some developments in the past year about new reimbursement developments affecting gene and cell therapies in the US. If you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So perhaps the biggest shift in the reimbursement landscape for gene and cell therapies that are drugs and biologicals was the enactment of the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, last August. And that IRA introduced a drug price negotiation program into Medicare. So that means for the first time, the Medicare agency will be quote unquote negotiating for certain higher priced drugs, with drugs selected for negotiation based on their Medicare spend, i.e. drugs that are sort of the highest Medicare spend get sort of selected first for negotiation in accordance with a statutory methodology. And although that program is framed as a negotiation, in many ways it bears some resemblance to a price control regime, in the sense that the Medicare agency has a whole lot of discretion in, at the end of the day, effectively determining what the maximum fair price that Medicare pays will be for a selected drug. And the program will start to be phased in over the next several years. For the first set of selected drugs, the price controls will start in 2026, and that will be affecting the 10 highest spend Medicare pharmacy benefit, or Part D drugs. It will then be expanded to outpatient and physician office medical benefit, or Part B drugs, in 2028, and that's presumably where gene and cell therapies are more likely to lie. And the program doesn't affect Part A or inpatient drugs. The number of drugs eligible for negotiation will slowly also increase over time. So while the program starts relatively narrow in scope, it's going to incrementally expand, and it could sort of dramatically change the landscape of Medicare reimbursement over time. I guess the good news for some new developers of gene and cell therapies is that selection for negotiation does have a time-based element. So if you're a drug, there's at least 7 years from approval, and a biologicals have 11 years from licensure before you're sort of eligible to be selected. And then there's an additional 2-year lag post-selection before any maximum fair price could take effect. That said, it's really important to monitor implementation of the program, which began this past spring, because the design of the program and the specific details of the implementation of various exceptions and data submission requirements, those could all impact sort of manufacturers greatly, as well as strategic reimbursement choices. Also, I guess it's worth highlighting that the IRA beyond the drug price negotiation program implemented a series of other changes. And among other things, that includes new inflation rebates that will require manufacturers to pay certain rebates if they raise prices for Medicare Part B and Part D drugs faster than the rate of inflation. And it'll likewise be very important to monitor the agency's implementation of that rebate program as well, which also similarly began this past spring.
Well, very important developments everyone should take mind of. And also, even though it might seem far away, I know that time elapses very quickly. It's important to lay the seeds early, right? Is to plan out the strategy and even build that into the development process. I know that we talk early from my perspective, working on FDA regulatory matters. We raise those questions early so that companies can start thinking about them and considering how that might impact even their clinical trial designs and some of those issues, because they could have an impact on some of the criteria that the regulators will use both in the United States and in the EU. So we've covered a huge amount in a short period of time. I want to thank you, James, and you, Charlotte, for making time. Obviously, there are many, many issues involved on which Hogan Lovells can help advise. And I would invite all of you in the audience to reach out to James and Charlotte and to me on various issues that arise. There will be some of us, including myself, physically at the conference. So hope to meet you all. And we would greatly appreciate the opportunity to explore ways we can help advance your mission to bring these life-saving and life-enhancing products to the patients who desperately need them.